A hungry man stole eggs and faced jail. But when the judge read his name, everything stopped. Behind the worn face was a soldier who saved lives and disappeared into silence. What happened next brought a city and a nation to tears. Greenville, South Carolina, October 2019. In the heart of the small downtown district, a man in his late 50s moved through the streets like a shadow. His name was Marcus Reynolds, though few knew it. Most simply recognized him as the silent figure who often sat outside the public library, wrapped in an old blanket, eyes fixed on a spot somewhere far beyond the city. He spoke to no one, asked for nothing, and rarely responded when spoken to. He had become, over time, a part of the urban scenery, unchanging, unnoticed, and untouched. Marcus spent his nights curled up behind the rear entrance of a local church, shielded slightly from the wind by the dumpster and the sloping wall. During the day, he wandered through alleyways and public parks, collecting aluminum cans from trash bins, stuffing them carefully into a large, fraying military-issued backpack. His clothes bore the evidence of years lived outside: a faded army green jacket, stained and stretched, the fabric torn in places, the American flag patch on the shoulder worn to threads. His boots had long since lost their soles. Despite the chill in the autumn air, he moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone accustomed to discomfort. Teenagers sometimes called out to him from across the street or tossed pebbles in his direction. Shop owners occasionally hosed down the sidewalks where he sat to keep him moving along. But Marcus never fought back, never raised his voice, never asked why. He simply moved to another bench, another shadowed doorway, another part of the city that would ignore him just as well as the last. One morning, as the sun struggled to burn through a gray sky, Marcus felt the sharp ache of hunger gnawing deeper than usual. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His fingers trembled slightly from the cold and fatigue. He entered a small corner grocery store, one he had passed 100 times but never dared to enter. The smell of warm bread and roasted peanuts filled the narrow aisles. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he reached a shelf stacked with eggs. Without hesitation, he slipped a carton into the inside of his jacket and turned toward the door. The security camera captured everything. The store clerk, glancing up from behind the register, immediately reached for the phone. Moments later, a police cruiser pulled to the curb. 2 officers stepped inside, found Marcus standing near the exit, and calmly approached him. He did not resist. He did not run. He did not speak. They placed handcuffs on his thin wrists and escorted him outside. At the station, Marcus was processed like any other petty offender. His fingerprints were taken. His belongings, a pocket knife, a weathered photograph, and his dog tags were logged. A tired-looking officer entered basic information into a computer, noting a few past infractions: loitering, trespassing, and 1 previous citation for shoplifting. Nothing violent, nothing unusual, just another file in a stack of forgotten stories. A preliminary court hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. The charge: misdemeanor theft of goods under $50. Marcus said nothing as they led him to a holding cell. He had seen this process before. He knew how it worked. No surprises, no expectations. Just the same gray walls, the same silence, the same life moving forward without anyone noticing he was still there. On Sunday evening, the halls of the Greenville County Courthouse stood quiet under the dimming autumn light. In her private chambers, Judge Melissa Harris sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of manila folders. A half-finished cup of coffee had long since gone cold beside her keyboard. She had made a habit of reviewing the docket for Monday ahead of time, hoping to catch any complications before they reached the bench. The cases were almost always predictable: public intoxication, probation violations, petty theft. Names came and went with little distinction, blurring into the administrative haze of small-town justice. She worked through the files quickly, scanning summaries with practiced indifference until one name gave her pause: Marcus Reynolds. It didn't immediately stand out, but something about the birthplace listed in his intake form, Fall River, Massachusetts, caught her attention. Her father had served in the Navy and often spoke of his time stationed near Fall River. A minor coincidence, perhaps, but it tugged at her curiosity. She set the folder aside and opened her laptop, accessing the courthouse's internal system. The documents attached to the case included a copy of Reynolds's arrest report, his intake form, and a scanned ID tag, worn, faded, but still legible. One field contained an old military identification number. Most judges wouldn't have gone further, but Melissa had always been meticulous. With a few keystrokes, she accessed the Department of Veterans Affairs portal. She entered the number and waited. The screen loaded slowly, then populated with a full profile. Marcus D. Reynolds, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, service years, 1983 to 2007, 3 deployments to Iraq, commendations for logistical coordination under fire, 2 Army Commendation Medals, 1 Bronze Star, no dishonorable actions, no flags for misconduct. The summary concluded with a notation, eligible for VA housing assistance, monthly pension, and medical coverage. At the bottom of the page, a red line caught her eye. Benefits suspended, July 2011. Reason, unable to verify current residence. Melissa leaned back in her chair. The system had simply stopped reaching him. Somewhere between a paperwork update and a mailing address that no longer existed, Marcus had fallen off the grid. No fraud, no revocation, just silence. His file had remained untouched for years, a digital ghost floating in a system too large and impersonal to notice his absence. She stared at the screen, rereading the details. This wasn't just a man who had stolen a carton of eggs. He was someone who had once worn the uniform, someone who had gone where few were willing, and someone who had been quietly discarded by the very system meant to support him. Her eyes lingered on his service photo, attached to the file as a black and white JPEG. In it, a younger Marcus stood in desert fatigues, arms crossed, eyes squinting against the harsh Middle Eastern sun. There was something in his posture, a quiet resilience, the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Melissa closed the folder slowly, her mind no longer on routine sentencing or standard procedures. Something in this case was different. Something deserved more than the automatic response. She reached for a notepad and began writing down details. This wasn't just another name on Monday's docket. This was a man who had once stood for something, and who now stood alone. Monday morning arrived with the usual chaos in the county courtroom. The air buzzed with the shuffle of papers, the scrape of chairs, and the low hum of clerks calling names and sorting schedules. Attorneys moved swiftly between benches, negotiating quick plea deals and confirming appearances. The gallery remained mostly empty, as it often did during early morning sessions, save for a few court employees and an overworked reporter scribbling notes on unrelated cases. Marcus Reynolds entered the courtroom in silence, his hands cuffed in front of him, his shoulders slightly hunched beneath the oversized jumpsuit issued at the holding facility. His face bore deep creases, not only from age, but from exposure, from hardship, from years of being unseen. He didn't look up. His steps were slow but steady, each one measured. The bailiff guided him to the defendant's seat without incident. No one in the room took special notice. To them, he was just another case, another unfortunate whose name would be forgotten by noon. At the prosecutor's table, a junior assistant reviewed the notes in a thin folder. The public defender assigned to Marcus glanced briefly at his client, made a quick note, and waited for the hearing to begin. The entire proceeding seemed set to follow a well-worn script. Charges read, plea entered, sentence issued, and on to the next name. Then Judge Melissa Harris entered the courtroom. She wore her robe with the usual composure, her expression composed, her movements practiced. But the moment her eyes landed on Marcus, something shifted behind them. She paused ever so slightly, her gaze lingering longer than necessary. The courtroom, unaware of the weight she now carried, remained oblivious. Marcus looked the same as in the photograph she had studied the night before, only weathered, diminished by time and neglect. Still, there was a stillness in his posture that felt deeper than fatigue. It was the quiet of someone who had once been needed, relied upon, and then abandoned. The prosecutor rose and began reading the formal charge in a flat, rehearsed tone. Theft of perishable goods, estimated value under $20, prior minor offenses noted, recommendation for continued detention pending further hearing. The delivery was routine. The tone was impersonal. Judge Harris listened briefly, then raised a hand, halting the proceedings. She looked again at Marcus, at the deep-set eyes and lined face, at the man who had survived more than the records could ever convey. She informed the room of a short recess and rose from the bench, The gavel never fell. Back in her chambers, she closed the door and walked to her desk. Her movements were deliberate, her breath steady but shallow. From a drawer, she retrieved the papers she had printed the night before. Marcus's full military record, his VA status, and the image that had haunted her since she first saw it. The photo showed a much younger Marcus in fatigues, his face streaked with dust, one arm supporting a small Iraqi girl wrapped in a tattered shawl. Behind them, the blurred shape of a helicopter hovered above the dry, broken ground. The caption beneath read, "American soldier saves child during crossfire evacuation." The story had circulated briefly during the height of the war, one of many small glimmers of humanity in a time of destruction. Then the news cycle moved on, and men like Marcus faded from public memory. But Melissa remembered. She had seen that photo once, years ago, in a magazine at her father's house. It had moved her then, an image of selflessness, of courage that required no ceremony. Now it was more than a story. It was a name sitting quietly in her courtroom, a life bent by time and oversight. She spread the documents out across her desk, her fingers brushing over the creases in the photo. There was no question anymore. This man deserved more than a rushed judgment and a recycled sentence. He had earned more than society had offered him since the day he was discharged. The courtroom would resume soon, but the weight of the moment had already settled into the judge's hands. What had started as another Monday hearing had become something else, something personal, something irreversible. A day like any other had just become the day everything changed. The afternoon session resumed under a different atmosphere. The courtroom, once sparsely occupied and filled with routine fatigue, now held a quiet tension. More people had gathered, individuals who were not part of the usual procession of petty crime and municipal hearings. Among them were representatives from a national veterans advocacy group, identifiable by the small pins on their lapels and the folders they clutched with purpose. Some had invited members of the local press who sat with notepads open and cameras ready, sensing a story unfolding. Near the front row sat a tall man in a tailored gray suit with a military bearing that had softened into civilian professionalism. He was the son of one of Marcus's former comrades, now an attorney practicing in Washington, D.C. He had flown in that morning after receiving a message from a fellow veteran. His presence brought a new weight to the proceedings. When he stood to speak, it was with quiet confidence, introducing himself as Marcus Reynolds' legal representative from that point forward. Behind him, a representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs sat waiting with documents in hand. When recognized by the court, he stepped forward to provide a summary of findings. According to their review, Marcus Reynolds had remained fully eligible for VA pension, housing assistance, and medical benefits since his discharge in 2007. However, due to a system migration in 2011, his file had been marked inactive after correspondence was returned undelivered. No follow-up had been conducted. The benefits were never revoked, only paused indefinitely in administrative limbo. Judge Harris listened without interrupting. Her pen moved steadily over her notepad as she documented every detail. She asked precise questions about policy, precedent, and the possibility of restitution. The VA representative acknowledged the error, offering no excuses. The courtroom, filled with people who had once overlooked Marcus, now bore witness to the consequences of bureaucratic negligence. Marcus sat quietly through it all, his posture unchanged. He remained seated at the defense table, hands folded loosely in front of him, head lowered slightly. Though his name was now spoken with authority and concern, his expression did not shift. There was no visible relief, no spark of hope. Years of silence had taught him not to expect much from systems or strangers. To Marcus, the presence of a lawyer claiming to represent him, the attention of federal officials, the rustle of news reporters, it all felt like noise in a distant room. Unreal, disconnected from the reality he had come to know. He didn't understand why people suddenly cared. He didn't trust that it would last. The judge did not issue a sentence. Instead, she ordered a continuation of the case pending further investigation. She instructed the clerk to coordinate directly with the Department of Veterans Affairs and set a provisional hearing for the following week. She made it clear that the court would not move forward until it had full clarity on Marcus Reynolds' status and rights. The gavel never came down with finality. The session closed with a sense of something unfinished, but undeniably changed. Marcus was led from the courtroom with the same quiet obedience as before, but the room he left behind had shifted. Eyes that had once looked past him now followed his exit with something resembling respect. He did not see the way the judge remained seated for several moments after adjournment, her hand resting motionless on the bench. He did not notice the reporters whispering over headlines or the VA official making urgent calls in the hallway. For Marcus, it was just another day of being moved from one place to another, of waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. But for the court, and for those who had begun to understand who he really was, the return point had passed. Nothing could go back to how it was before. The story had entered the open, and now it demanded to be heard. 2 days later, the courtroom was once again filled, but the atmosphere was unlike anything it had been before. The murmur of anticipation, the soft clicks of camera shutters from the press bench, and the presence of familiar city officials all signaled that something had shifted. Judge Melissa Harris entered the room with a composed but solemn expression, her black robe moving silently as she took her seat. The clerk called the session to order, and after a few procedural remarks, she delivered her ruling. The charges against Marcus Reynolds were dismissed. The court recognized that his actions had stemmed from necessity and compounded institutional failure. In her statement, Judge Harris directed the Department of Veterans Affairs to expedite the restoration of his benefits, with retroactive compensation to be calculated. She also issued an order ensuring that Marcus would be given access to immediate medical care and temporary housing. Representatives from the mayor's office, seated in the front row, approached his new legal counsel after the hearing and offered assistance in navigating local services, including state ID recovery and veteran-specific housing programs. Word of the ruling spread quickly. Journalists who had been present at the initial hearing published detailed reports highlighting Marcus's background and the mishandling of his VA case. Headlines referred to him as the invisible hero of Greenville and the soldier time forgot. Photos of Marcus from decades earlier, particularly the one where he carried a wounded child away from a burning convoy, were circulated across news, networks, and social media platforms. His story became more than a court proceeding. It became a point of national conversation. Within days, former members of Marcus's unit began to reach out. Emails and phone calls came into the courthouse, to the Veterans Association, and even to the city offices. Men who had once served beside him, some now living quiet suburban lives, others still affiliated with the military, recognized the name and the face. They remembered the calm voice on the radio during convoys, the steady presence under fire, the man who had taken the most dangerous shift without complaint. They spoke of him with reverence, calling him not just a fellow soldier, but a brother. While many in the public expressed admiration and sympathy, others questioned the narrative. Anonymous commentators online suggested that the story had been exaggerated for attention or that the government had rushed to cover a mistake. But the official records, the testimonies, and the enduring silence of Marcus himself contradicted such skepticism. He had never sought the spotlight, never offered his story willingly. What had emerged had been pieced together by others, by those who had once depended on him and now chose to speak. For the people of Greenville, the man they had passed on the sidewalk for years had suddenly become impossible to ignore. He had been the figure hunched outside the library, the man sleeping behind the church, the one whose presence had once blended into the background. Now his name carried weight. His face appeared on television screens. He had been transformed from a forgotten shadow into a symbol of how society fails, and how sometimes, though rarely, it attempts to make things right. Marcus said little in the aftermath. He accepted the decisions and the help, but kept to himself. He had spent too long in silence to change quickly. Still, something was different. When he walked into the clinic for his first medical checkup, staff greeted him with kindness. When he visited the municipal building to complete paperwork, people held the door for him. These gestures, small and simple, were foreign to him. The tragedy of his life had never been loud. It had unfolded slowly, steadily, away from attention. But now, without ever raising his voice, Marcus Reynolds had forced a city, and perhaps a nation, to remember. Not just him, but the countless others like him, the names that get lost, the records that don't get transferred. The heroes no one sees until it's too late. and in doing so, he reminded them all that some names were never meant to be forgotten. 6 months passed. Spring settled gently over Greenville, softening the edges of the city that had once looked right through him. The trees along the main streets had begun to bloom, casting dappled shade across sidewalks where the cold winds of winter had once howled. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and in the quiet neighborhoods just beyond the city center, a small house with peeling white shutters stood with a porch light that now stayed on each night. Marcus Reynolds lived there now. The home, modest but comfortable, had been provided by a local veteran support charity that had taken on his case after the court ruling. He had been slow to accept their offer, unsure if he deserved it or if it would last. But in time, he had moved in. A caseworker had helped furnish it with essentials, and a nurse visited weekly to monitor his health. He had regained some weight. The deep lines in his face remained, but his shoulders had lifted slightly, no longer pulled down by hunger or cold. Each morning, Marcus left his house at the same time, walking the familiar path toward downtown. He wore clean, weather-appropriate clothes now, donated but carefully chosen. A soft jacket replaced the tattered army coat, and his shoes no longer left his feet raw. He carried a book tucked under one arm, sometimes a paperback novel, sometimes a borrowed volume of military history. His destination was always the same, the old bench outside the public library. He would sit there for an hour or two, watching the flow of people through the square. The same people who had once passed without acknowledgement now sometimes stopped. Some greeted him with a quiet nod or a few words. Others simply made eye contact, a small gesture that meant more than it seemed. Children no longer mocked him. Some pointed him out to their parents, whispering what they'd learned in school. A few even waved. The city had not changed overnight, but a small current had shifted. His presence was no longer invisible. The space he occupied was no longer dismissed. Across the county, a new initiative had been born out of his story. The Reynolds Project, led by the same veteran organization that had stepped in months earlier, now offered legal and administrative aid to former service members who had lost touch with their benefits or records. The program received its first grant from the state, and Judge Melissa Harris became its public face. She attended veteran-focused events, gave interviews, and worked with attorneys to prevent what had happened to Marcus from happening again. In one of Greenville's middle schools, the library set up a display board titled Remembering Marcus. It featured newspaper clippings, photos of him in uniform, and testimonials from those who had served with him. Teachers used his story in lessons on civic responsibility and the importance of paying attention to those who are overlooked. A few students wrote essays about him, comparing his resilience to the characters they read about in fiction. Marcus did not speak to reporters. He never sought out microphones or attention. But at the request of the veterans group, he agreed to record a short video message for a conference. Sitting in his living room with the sound of birds outside and the glow of morning light behind him, he spoke a single sentence into the camera. His voice was quiet but clear. "I just want to make sure no one else disappears the way I did." On Memorial Day, the city held a ceremony at the Central Plaza. Folding chairs were arranged neatly before a raised platform draped in flags. Veterans from all eras gathered in full uniform, and among them stood Marcus, invited as an honored guest. He did not speak from the podium. He did not need to. When the national anthem began to play, he rose with the others, his posture straightened not by formality, but by choice. For the first time in years, he lifted his head fully. His eyes scanned the horizon, steady and unafraid. There was no bitterness in his expression, no anger in his stance. What remained was something simpler, an enduring calm, earned not from triumph but from survival. The people around him clapped, some saluted. Others simply looked at him with quiet acknowledgement. He was no longer lost in the margins. His story, once buried under dust and silence, had been pulled into the light. Marcus Reynolds, once forgotten, now stood in the center of his city, no longer a question but an answer.